In today's video, I will be taking a look at a hypothetical 2024 election map if the polls were to underestimate Joe Biden. Now, I will be looking at the numbers offering my analysis. Now, currently, polling does show Joe Biden with a 0.7% deficit over Donald Trump in the national polling, with Trump holding a consistent lead over Biden. But in 2020, polls had Joe Biden up by 8.4% on election day, or a 3.9% estimation of Joe Biden compared to the actual 4.5% popular vote victory for the president. That means in this video, I will be adjusting each of these states, but 3.9% from the polling in favor of Joe Biden. This would mean in this scenario, Biden will win the popular vote by a margin of 3.2%. Now, that is certainly a distinct possibility, because of the fact that there is a substantial third-party vote. Many of these voters may be coming from both Biden and Trump, but there are also Green Party candidates like Jill Stein or Cornel West, that is definitely taking more from Joe Biden. So there is a possibility, and a distinct possibility, that Biden is underestimated by the polls. However, even a 3.2% national victory for Biden is not all that impressive, considering he won the 2020 popular vote by 4.5 points. If Biden had won the popular vote by 3.2 points, he would have likely lost the election, but he would have lost the states of Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona, and potentially Pennsylvania. If he had lost the three of the states that I mentioned here, that my mouse had just hovered over, he would have only gotten 269 electoral votes, one short of becoming president. Anyways, that is a discussion for another video. I'll be filling in this electoral map if the polls were to underestimate Joe Biden. Just saying again, this is a hypothetical and not a prediction. Now we'll begin filling in this electoral map from alphabetical order. Now, the first state on the alphabet here is the state of Alabama. In the current polling, we see that there is one poll with RFK Jr. up 27% over Joe Biden, but that we know that is pretty bull crap, and we see that is funded by RFK. What we see generally is that Trump is ahead of Biden by 21 percentage points. When we apply that 4% polling error, that does have Trump winning the state by 17 points. Now going to the next state here, the state of Alaska. Alaska is quite interesting. Again, we see that Kennedy, with his funded polls, have Trump up by just 6 in the state. Again, just like what I was saying, this is not credible. We can just disregard these polls, but we do see that Trump is up by about 10 points over Joe Biden in the current aggregate, which means that when we adjust it, Joe Biden is expected to lose the state to Donald Trump by 6 percentage points, or barely sufficient for a likely margin. Alaska is a state that has trended consistently towards Joe Biden and the Democratic Party, but it's obviously not going to flip in 2024. Now, the next state here, we are actually upon a very competitive state, the state of Arizona. Right now, Trump holds a 3.71% lead over Joe Biden in the current polling aggregate. Trump holds 42.9% to Joe Biden's 39.7%. If the polls do underestimate Joe Biden by 3.9%, that does give Biden the state by a tilt margin. This is almost the identical margin as the 2020 map, where Joe Biden won the state by just 0.3%. What the state of Arizona is going to be decided by is two counties, really. Maricopa County and Pima County. Trump did very well in the rural areas. For example, Graham County, right? Greenlee County, heavily trended Republican. Even Santa Cruz County, heavily trended Republican despite being a heavily Democratic county. The problem is those counties with somewhat larger Hispanic populations in Santa Cruz and more rural voters in Greenlee and Graham, those are not the counties that are going to decide the election. In all realisticality, it will be Maricopa County. Maricopa County holds almost 2/3 of the state's population. Combined with Pima, they are very suburban, exurban type of counties with very large cities. Phoenix, where Maricopa County is located, and Tulsa, where Pima County is located. What we're going to see here is whether Joe Biden is able to do well enough in these counties to offset some of the gains Trump would make in the rural regions. I do believe that if Trump is able to make Maricopa within 3%, Trump will probably win the state. In the end, only time will tell. Right now, according to this math at least, this does give Joe Biden the state of Arizona by a tilt margin. Now going to the next state here, the state of Arkansas, it's not surprising that Trump is going to win the state of Arkansas. Right now, the two polls between Joe Biden and Donald Trump have Trump up by 28%. Adjusted for polling error, he's still going to win the state by 24, a similar margin to his victory in 2020. Going to the state of California here, we see that Biden is substantially underperforming underperforming his 2020 numbers in the state of California. Biden won the state of California, the largest state in the union, by almost 30 points. Even if he does overperform the polls by 4%, he has still lost about 5% of ground. But we all know that the state of California is going to go for Joe Biden, and it really isn't a substantial point of discussion unless you're talking about the popular vote. Now going to the next state here, the state of Colorado, this race is actually somewhat competitive if we look at the polls at raw numbers, and if we see that the polls adjusted in favor of Donald Trump, Trump actually has seemingly a realistic shot of winning the state. Obviously again, Donald Trump and Joe Biden are both pulling behind RFK Jr. in these polls. That's absolutely bullcrap. Nevertheless, here we do see that if you adjust it for the polling error, right now we have Joe Biden here up by 7 on the 538 aggregate or so. A 4% adjustment in favor of Biden would bring that margin to 11 points, a likely margin just shy of a safe margin. Now going to the next state here, the state of Connecticut. Right now, again, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is not going to get something like 40% of the vote in a state like Connecticut. Nevertheless, we do see that Joe Biden only has about a 12% lead, quite concerning considering he won the state by 20%. Again, we see in some of these polling, we see that Joe Biden is experiencing some slippage, especially with a relatively high uncommitted vote in the state like Connecticut backing Democratic primaries. Now, nevertheless, after adjusted for polling error, we do see that Joe Biden is up in the state of Connecticut by about 16 points, enough for a safe margin. Now we head to the state of Delaware, where there is no polling except the polls between Joe Biden and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Obviously, again, these polls are not credible, but I'm just going to give it to Joe Biden by a safe margin because at the end of the day, we all know that who is going to win the state of Delaware. It's not going to be Donald Trump, it's not going to be RFK Jr., it's going to be Joe Biden. We look at the electoral vote count right now, Joe Biden sits at 85 electoral votes to Donald Trump at 18. However, most of the states currently filled in are states with an inherent blue tilt. Anyways, however, Arizona, pretty much a must-win for Donald Trump, right now is in the tilt Democratic column. Though it's not necessarily a must-must win, Trump can still win the election without winning the state of Arizona. Going to the District of Columbia here, we don't have any polls. Biden was up 85% in the polls in Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, and we saw that Trump had no realistic shot. Trump, in the most recent poll taken there, was down 89 percentage points, 94% to 5%. And in fact, polls actually overestimated Donald Trump here. Biden absolutely destroyed Donald Trump. Unsurprising, D.C. goes easily to Joe Biden, bringing him up to 88 electoral votes. Obviously, that's not surprising. In the state of Florida here, we do see a much more interesting map. Trump is up 10.3%, double digits in the state of Florida, a state that usually is very competitive, a state that George W. Bush in 2000 won by just 527 votes in. This was a state that was hugely contentious, and Florida generally has a tendency of having less third-party support. Anyways, Trump is at 47.2%, almost a majority considering how many third-party voters there are generally in this election. I'm going to give it to Donald Trump here by a likely margin. He would end up winning by about 7 points, which is sufficient again for a likely margin. Now going to the state of Georgia here. In the state of Georgia, this is a crucial one. This is a state where Joe Biden actually won in 2020. In the state of Georgia here, he won by just 0.23%. The closest state in terms of percentage difference, with Biden winning the state by just about 11,780 votes. Anyways, what is going to decide the election here is the Atlanta suburbs. Not only is the percentage-wise numbers there for Joe Biden, but is there the turnout there for Biden to win the state? We know that Trump is going to get huge numbers in the rural areas, in MTG's former district over here, as well as some of the rural areas over here. Trump will also probably make marginal gains in some of the rural black counties, and those counties are probably going to shift towards him. The question is, again, if Democrats are able to get those big shifts in the Democratic areas around the Atlanta suburbs. Gwinnett County, perfect example. Cobb County, right? The fourth most, I believe the second and third most populated counties in the state. These are very important for Democrats' chances of actually winning the state. Biden needs to be overperforming in both Gwinnett and Cobb to have any realistic chance of winning. We're talking about Biden winning Gwinnett by at least 20 and winning Cobb by at least like 17. Anyways, I do not think that Biden will end up winning the state of Georgia, and the polls does confirm my suspicion, with Trump leading by 5.8 percentage points. Even with a 3.9% overperformance by Biden, he would still end up losing the state. And if you look at all these polling data here, you can see that Trump has not been down in a single poll, unless you consider this RFK poll here, which is again heavily uncredible. Anyways, we're going to give Georgia here to Donald Trump, even after the adjusted margin to Trump by 1.9% margin, just between a lean and tilt category. Now going to the next state here, the state of Hawaii. We all know that Joe Biden will win the state of Hawaii. Again, I'm not going to entertain this type of bullcrap. We're going to see Joe Biden winning the state of Hawaii. Now going to the next state here, which is the state of Idaho. We see that again, these polls are not very useful. Trump has a 29% lead over Joe Biden in a head-to-head matchup, which, again, right, that is a safe margin, even if you adjust it with a 4% margin of error when we look at the polling data. Going to the state of Illinois here, we see that Trump still has about a 15% deficit against Joe Biden. When we adjust the polling error, we see that Joe Biden has about a 19% lead here. Again, I'm not going to factor into the RFK polls. Joe Biden is going to win the state of Illinois, bringing him up to 111 electoral votes over Donald Trump, who sits at 68 electoral college votes. Now going to the next state here, the state of Indiana. In the state of Indiana, unsurprising here, Trump does have a lead of about 20 points over Joe Biden in the two head-to-head polls. Now what we're going to see after a 4% shift in favor of Biden is still a double-digit safe margin of victory for Donald Trump in the state of Indiana, despite not selecting Mike Pence for vice president this time around. Now going to the next state here, which will be the state of Iowa. Now Iowa here, traditionally a very competitive state. Polls do suggest that Trump is probably going to win the state by double digits, around a 11% margin, sufficient for a pretty much a safe categorization. But with that 4% polling margin in favor of Joe Biden, we're going to see Iowa in this likely Republican column. Now going to the next state here, which will be the state of Kansas. Kansas is a state that is slightly trending blue, but unsurprisingly here, Trump does win the state of Kansas, even after we adjust it for polling error. Trump has about a 15% lead. Actually, if you look at the margin here, after adjusted for the polling error, if Trump does end up performing 4% worse than the polls, he actually only wins the state by about 11%, which is only sufficient for a likely margin. However, nevertheless, the state has a overwhelming Republican heritage. It's not going to flip to Joe Biden. Now the next state here, the state of Kentucky. Unsurprisingly, in the state of Kentucky, Trump is going to win it against Joe Biden, right now by about 24% according to a polling aggregate. When you adjust it 4% in favor of Joe Biden, we still see that Trump is going to win it by more than 20 points, again sufficient for a safe margin. That brings Trump to almost 100 electoral votes, while Biden stays at 111 electoral college votes. Moving on here to the next state, which will be the state of Louisiana. Right now, with the current polls right now, Trump has a 15% lead on a 1-to-1 poll against Joe Biden. However, when we look at essentially the polls adjusted, Trump only has an 11% advantage. Again, quite a significant underperformance from his about 90% win in the state. But again, this is not particularly accurate. It's just one poll essentially that we're factoring in. Now the next state here, the state of Maine. This is quite interesting. Again, I'm going to ignore the RFK polls. I think RFK actually has a good chance of actually getting a lot of the votes from Maine because it is quite an interesting state. Anyways, we look at right now, Trump has about a 2% deficit in the Maine at-large vote, but when we look at this Biden plus 11 pollster, it was actually taken about a year ago. So I'm really going to be factoring these two polls more, which on average has Trump up by about 2.5 points. When we have the polls adjusted, it's still going to be a lean margin here for Joe Biden. He's probably going to carry Maine's 1st congressional district if he carries Maine's at-large vote, in this case by a safe margin. Trump, it does look like he has about a likely margin of victory in the 2nd district as of the current polls. In fact, you can actually make an argument for safe, but I'm going to put it as likely for good measure. Now, the next state here, which will be the state of Maryland. Maryland, we all know here that Joe Biden is favored in the state of Maryland by various different margins. However, if Biden does end up winning the state of Maryland by something like 14 points, that is a big concern because of the fact in 2020 he won the state by 30 points. In fact, by more than that, by more than a 2-to-1 margin. So it's quite concerning how much slippage he has in the state of Maryland, partially because it is the most African American state and the most heavily minority state in the entire United States, and pretty much Biden has some slippage with those minority voters. This is an excellent example of that, though Maryland obviously does go to Biden here by about 20-something points. Now, the next state here, which will end up being the state of Massachusetts. In the state of Massachusetts here, not surprising at all, Joe Biden with a hefty lead over Donald Trump. This is a state where Biden has less slippage, but still some. We see that a lot of younger voters around Boston, more progressive voters, are not so happy to back Joe Biden, but nevertheless, most of them will probably still do so. And we see Massachusetts in the safe blue column. Joe Biden is officially now halfway there to the presidential win at 135 electoral votes. Donald Trump has cracked 100 at 108. However, the most crucial states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, have yet to be filled in. However, that would not be the same after the state of Michigan right now is filled in. Trump has a 1.3% lead over Joe Biden in the state of Michigan, and he has consistently held a lead, though his lead has tightened over the past month or so, as originally when the polls aggregate started, Trump had a 3.5% lead. That lead expanded to 5, and now it's down to about 1.3% because of some recent polls that do have this race a lot tighter. What we see is that Trump still has a lead in many polls, especially if we go again a bit earlier. But we see that Trump has a 15% lead in an outlier. Kennedy polls, again, I'm not going to really dive into that. What we see right now is actually in a multi-way race, Trump does a bit worse than what he does in a one-on-one race, which is quite interesting. I always thought that the third parties were going to end up benefiting Donald Trump. Anyways, what we are going to look out for in the state of Michigan is really a couple of things. First off, Detroit County, is there enough Democratic support in Wayne County to end up giving Biden a good margin? If Joe Biden ends up winning the county by more than 300,000 votes, that is a good sign for Biden, but if Trump is able to narrow that victory to less than 250,000 net votes, that is a good sign for Donald Trump. Many of these areas in Detroit, such as Dearborn, may not be so enthusiastic to vote for Biden because many of these, Middle East type of Americans, those type of Americans, they're not so happy to vote for Joe Biden again because of his handling of the Israel-Hamas war. Also in Washington now, we see that Ann Arbor, a college town, what we're going to see here is Joe Biden able to run up these huge margins and also those high turnouts. Another thing to look out for is if Joe Biden is able to get those large margins in counties like Oakland County. If Joe Biden is able to maintain, in best case scenario for Biden is that he expands his 14% victory in Oakland County over Donald Trump. What we're also going to be looking at is if Joe Biden is able to expand his lead in Kent County, an area that has been heavily trending away from Republicans. Joe Biden became the first Democratic president to win Kent County in about 60 years. Nevertheless, here Trump has a lot of room to grow, especially in the rural areas. And some of the areas, right, we're talking about more voters being turned out in a county like Wayne County, where just a lot of voters are not enthusiastic to end up backing Biden. That could be Trump's path to victory in the state of Michigan. Right now, he does hold a 1.5% lead over Joe Biden. However, when we adjust for that 3.9% margin of difference, what we see is that Joe Biden ends up winning the state by 2.6%, which is consequentially very close to his 2020 performance. However, even if he does end up overperforming polls by 4 points, he actually falls short of his 155,000 vote lead in the state of Michigan. Nevertheless, it is still sufficient for a lean characterization for Joe Biden. Now going to the next state here, which will be the state of Minnesota, another competitive state here. What we see is that Minnesota still consistently shows Biden up by various different margins. The average is about Biden plus 4 to 5. If we adjust for that 4% difference, what we're going to see is that Joe Biden is going to win the state of Minnesota by 8. What we're going to see here is the high uncommitted vote. 20% of the state voted uncommitted in the Democratic primaries, mostly surrounding Hennepin County and Ramsey County. Both of those counties saw about 25% of its voters vote uncommitted, a rather high number. In fact, in Hennepin and Ramsey, it was actually very close to 30%. Is Democrats able to turn out in these counties will be hugely important for Democrats' chances of victory. However, Biden won the state by 7 or more than 230,000 votes, so I don't expect much in the state. I do expect Biden will still win because their rural areas are kind of not very populated. So Biden still probably wins the state of Minnesota, just like the polls predict. Now going to the state of Mississippi here, Trump is up by about 18% in the one poll taken. That is a 1-to-1 race between Biden, which means after a 4% adjustment, Trump still wins the state by 14 points. Interesting that Mississippi is safe, but the state of Louisiana, neighboring, is actually only in the likely Republican column. Now that does bring Joe Biden to 160 electoral votes, Trump at 114. Out of the 5 states that Joe Biden was able to win in 2020, but Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump in 2016, Biden holds 2 of them, Michigan and Arizona, while Trump holds 1 of them, the state of Georgia. The next state here, which will be the state of Missouri here, we see in the state of Missouri, Trump still consistently holds about a 16% lead. When we adjust that with the polling, Trump still wins the state by about 12, which is just sufficient for a safe margin. What we see right now is some of the Republican states starting to fill in, but many of the New England states, as well as some of the more liberal states like California, also filled into this map. 254 toss-up electoral votes remain. Now moving on here, which will be the next state, the state of Montana. Unsurprisingly, right now, Trump does have about a 20% lead in the state of Montana. Even if you adjust it for the polling error, that still gives Trump a 16% lead in Montana, a safe margin. Now going to the next state here, which would be the state of Nebraska. Nebraska it's interesting, where we see that the state of Nebraska does split its electoral college votes. Right now, Trump has about a 16% lead in one poll or an 18% lead or in another poll, which averages to about 17%. Now, that would mean in this adjusted map that Trump wins the state by 13. A 13% victory is not going to be enough for Trump to win Nebraska second, and I'm going to put it in the likely blue column. The first district is also going to be likely because the third district is the really Republican one, a district that Trump won by 49 points. That is a larger margin than what he won in a state like West Virginia or a state like Wyoming. It's redder than both of those states, which I generally consider the most Republican states of the United States. Now going to the next state here, the state of Nevada. This is also an interesting one. Hillary Clinton carried it in 2016, Biden carried it by an identical margin in 2020, and right now Trump has a 5% lead in the polls. Now that is quite consistent across the board. Trump maintains a pretty substantial lead over Joe Biden in pretty much every single poll here. Kennedy is polling at 11%, and some of the other candidates and undecided is taking away about another 9% of the electorate. Now what we're gonna really be looking at here in the state of Nevada, it's really just one county here, the county of Clark. What we do expect here and anticipate is that Joe Biden is probably going to do slightly better in Washoe County, an area that is trending blue. Trump is going to be doing slightly better in some of the rural areas, and we're going to be looking at Clark County here. Trump needs about a 3% improvement in Clark County to win the state because, just as I said, Washoe County, about 13% of the state's population, is trending slightly blue. However, Clark County is trending red. Again, what we saw in 2022 here, Adam Laxalt and Joe Lombardo both made significant inroads in Clark County as the Democratic candidates did quite poorly in that county. However, the difference was that Adam Laxalt lost, but Joe Lombardo won. Again, I do expect that if Trump is able to cut that lead to about 50,000 votes or slightly less than that, then Trump has a pretty good shot of winning the state of Nevada. But if the lead is above 50,000, it does look a bit more challenging, especially if the lead is above about 65,000. That would make the race pretty improbable for Donald Trump to end up carrying. Anyways, the state of Nevada right now, even if you adjust it for that 3.9% polling error, does still have Trump up by about 1%. Again, this is this is a flip from Hillary Clinton's column back in 2016, and I anticipate will probably be the only one on this map. Now going to the next state here, which will be the state of New Hampshire. In the state of New Hampshire here, Biden does consistently hold a lead. The only two polls that suggest that Haley is ahead or some other candidate, it's with Sununu, Tim Scott, and Nikki Haley. None of them factor in Donald Trump. Trump is realistically going to lose the state because it is more college educated, and Nikki Haley garnered 43% in the Republican primary there because a lot of independents, they're only willing to vote for Nikki Haley and not willing to vote for another Republican. Anyways, right now Trump enjoys about a 5% deficit against Joe Biden, which is smaller than his lead back in 2020 in the state, where Joe Biden was able to win the state by about 7. Again, where Democrats are able to do well, for example, Manchester, Rockingham County, right? These are areas that are more college educated, areas that have moved away from the Republican Party. The state of Nevada here, very small state, but also very populated in terms of some of its cities. A very large white college educated population. We're going to see that Joe Biden does end up winning the state by about 9 points on this map, sufficient for a likely margin. A state that Trump probably won't contest in 2024. Now going to the next state here, which will be the state of New Jersey. New Jersey in terms of polling is actually somewhat competitive. Biden's up by 5 in one and up by 6 in another. Even if Biden does about 4% better than the polls expect, that's still only sufficient for a likely margin in New Jersey. Not super good considering Biden won the state by about 16 points in 2020. Right now, even if Biden overperforms the polls, Biden's only going to be up by about 10 points. Again, not a good performance. The next state here is the state of New Mexico. New Mexico, Biden does consistently have a lead, although this 2% lead is a bit concerning. Biden's average is about a 7 to 8% lead over Donald Trump, and if you add about a 4% overperformance, that is sufficient to give Joe Biden the state of New Mexico by a safe margin, because the one poll that does suggest this race being very competitive does suggest that Republican is Ron DeSantis, which is not the case here. Now going to the next state here, which will be the state of New York. New York, you have seen a lot of slippage here for Joe Biden. In fact, in a poll between Joe Biden and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., again, pretty doubtful of this, but that Biden is only tied against Kennedy, not the best sign. What we see is that, again, Democrats have slipped a lot in the New York City area, right? For example, Biden got 72.2% in Queens County, but Kathy Hochul, the Republican, the Democrat in the governor's race, or the New York City mayor, Eric Adams. Eric Adams only got 60% in Queens. That's not a good sign for a Democrat in such a blue area. Traditionally hugely Democratic populated, now there's a lot of voters who are actually resenting the Democrats. Anyways, with a 4% overperformance, Joe Biden does win the state of New York by 14 points. Not as good as his 21% victory, 23% victory in New York back in 2020. But I mean, Democrats will probably take it because, again, they have lost a lot of ground in the state of New York. Right now on the Electoral College map, Joe Biden holds 212 electoral votes to Donald Trump at 138. Trump needs to win the bulk of the remaining states to end up being president, but I mean a lot of rural states are left to be filled in. The next state here will be the state of North Carolina, another interesting one to watch. Trump has about a 6% lead over Joe Biden, and Kennedy polls at about 8.5%, one of the states where he polls lower at. Again, we see that Kennedy is ahead of Joe Biden apparently by 10 points in this 1-to-1 poll. What we see is that Trump does consistently hold a lead over Joe Biden, but if Biden does end up doing about 4 points better, that narrows the lead to about 2.4%. What we see in the state of North Carolina here is that Democrats are probably going to still do better in Mecklenburg County and Wake County, the two Democratic population centers in the state, as well as some of the other suburban/exurban counties like Union County, Caribous County, or Gaston County. These are areas where Joe Biden did overperform in 2020, as well as right around Buncombe County, which is again a relatively blue region. However, Republicans are going to see massive improvements in the rural areas, and we're not talking about these rural red regions, we're talking about these very blue areas. Really, these are areas where there are heavy black populations. You can probably make a majority black district in this type of this area of the state. The problem is those black voters, they're only voting about 70-30 for Democrats because this is the more rural areas of the state, less college educated, more Trump supporters than the average type of black community. And what we're going to see here is probably Democrats still end up winning this area, but not by as much. And we move down here to around New Hanover and its areas and its surrounding regions. New Hanover is probably going to end up trending blue in this election, but the rural areas heavily trending towards the Republican regions, as well as Cumberland County. I do believe they're going to trend red, especially this district over here, heavily trending Republican. We're definitely going to see Trump continue to make inroads in those regions. Overall, though, when we adjust it to the map here, still a lean victory for Donald Trump. That boosts him up to 154 electoral votes, about 60 under Joe Biden's number right now. Now going to the next state here, which is the state of North Dakota. North Dakota, not surprising, Trump has a 37% lead. Even when you adjust it, that is still a 34% lead for Donald Trump. Now the next state here, which will be the state of Ohio. Ohio is a state where it's actually somewhat competitive. According to the polls, it's within single digits. Now, we obviously know that Joe Biden's not going to win the state of Ohio, but that if Joe Biden does end up overperforming the polls by 4%, that state is technically within about 6%, a pretty good margin for a Democrat to lose the state by. Now, however, Trump is still leading by double digits in most of the polls, and I'm not really sure how they got this 9.6% difference. Realistically, when we're looking at the general picture, Trump is up by about 11 to 12 points. What we're seeing in the state of Ohio is slippage for Democrats in some of these areas. For example, Mahoning County, a county that voted for Democrats historically by like 20 points. This is a county now that is won by Donald Trump. Again, shift from 2016, Mahoning, 5-point shift towards Donald Trump, as well as some of the rural areas here. For example, Noble County, just a random county, Pike County, right, small population centers, but these are areas that are heavily trending red, and Trump netting a couple hundred here, a couple hundred there, sufficient for him to win the state by a huge margin. Democrats are probably going to overperform in Franklin County, overperform in a county like Delaware or a county like Hamilton. Although these are much larger counties in terms of population, especially Franklin County and Hamilton County, it's not going to be enough for Democrats to win the state or make it remarkably close. I'm going to make the state in the likely Republican column, giving Trump 174 Electoral College votes. Now going to the next state here, which will be the state of Oklahoma. Oklahoma, unsurprising here, Trump does have about a 30% advantage in the polls. Even when you adjust it, going to be safely in the Republican column. Now going to the next state here, the state of Oregon. In the state of Oregon here, 10% lead for Biden in one poll, 15% in the other. We're still going to see Biden win the state by a safe margin, especially when you adjust the polls 4% in favor of Joe Biden. Now going to the next state here, the state of Pennsylvania. The state of Pennsylvania is a must-win for Joe Biden. It is his home state. He is down by 1.8%, but there are some caveats. If the polls underestimate Joe Biden by 3.9%, he's going to win the state by 2.1% or barely a lean margin. Now, the state of Pennsylvania could be very crucial in the 2020 election and 2024 election. It was the tipping point state in 2020 and could be in 2024. Now, Democrats have an advantage in the state of Pennsylvania. Joe Biden was born in the state, and there's also a Senate race in the state where Bob Casey is up for re-election against Dave McCormick. Bob Casey is heavily favored as he is pretty much an institution in the state. Really, what we're talking about here is the Philadelphia suburbs, Philadelphia, Delaware County, as well as some of its suburbs. So these 5 counties plus Allegheny County is essentially half of the state's population. So these areas will pretty much decide the state. Around all of the states, like 70-something other counties, make up about the remaining half. Really, where Democrats need to improve on, pretty much Chester County, right? This is a historically a Republican county. Pat Toomey, who ran for the Senate seat in 2016 on the same ballot as Donald Trump, he actually won Chester County as a Republican. Now it's a heavily blue county, right? These are the areas where Democrats expect they will end up building a pretty substantial lead over the Republicans. Republicans want to make inroads in an area like Philadelphia County, where the county actually trended 3.5% to the right compared to 2016. Furthermore, Republicans want to make inroads in some of these rural areas, pretty much max them out, get like 70-75% of the vote in some of these instances, or even about 80% of the vote in some of the rural areas. Again, these are relatively smaller rural counties, for example, Indiana County, right? For example, Clearfield County. Republicans are only going to net like 15,000 votes in these type of areas, but these small pockets, small overperformances end up adding up in a general picture. I do believe Biden is narrowly favored right now in the state of Pennsylvania, though I would not say by a lean margin. That joins the state of Michigan as well in the lean Democratic column, which does bring Joe Biden to 239 electoral votes, which means he's very close to winning the presidency. Now look at the electoral map here. Again, we see that 3 of the most important states here, Nevada, Georgia, and North Carolina, are going for the Trump column, while 3 of the most important states, Arizona, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, are going towards the Biden column. Now we go to the next state here, which will be the state of Rhode Island. Rhode Island, not surprising here, Biden does hold about a 14% lead. However, that is a relatively slim lead considering he won the state by 21 in 2020. Nevertheless, here, Rhode Island, after the adjustment, Biden plus 18. Going to the next state here, the state of South Carolina, with a heavy minority presence here. Trump is leading in pretty much every single poll by a respectable margin of about 15 to 18%. Even with a adjustment, it's not going to be enough for Joe Biden to make any type of inroads in the state of South Carolina, safe towards Donald Trump. Going to the next state here, the state of South Dakota. In the state of South Dakota here, we see that Trump is up by about 24%, even after the adjustment, 20% lead for Donald Trump in the state of South Dakota. Going to the next state here, the state of Tennessee. The state of Tennessee here, not surprising, Trump has about a 25% lead over Joe Biden in the state of Tennessee, even after the adjustment, Trump plus 20. Going to the next state here, which will be the state of Texas. Texas is an interesting one here. Trump still has a double-digit victory. However, right now, county is actually polling quite high at about 12.3%, pretty respectable for a third-party candidate. We see in the recent polls here, actually these polls don't have county at that good of a margin. Anyways, if you look at the state of Texas, there's a couple of really major components to the state. Out of about the 270 counties in the state, 200 of them are very rural, very Republican. However, the rural counties in the state of Texas, contrary to its overwhelmingly large population, it's actually quite small. We go to Random County, Dallam County, Sherman County, right, Armstrong County, Motley County, for example, Jones County, right, we see these counties, they're like 80-90% Republican, but they're very small. But even these small counties, right, 2,000 votes for the Republican here, 4,000 for the Republican here, maybe 500, right? These small things do end up adding up, especially when you have 200 of them. When you look at the Democratic areas, right, we have Houston County, we have Travis County, we have Bexar County, and we have Dallas County. Well, generally the keys for a Democrat to win the state of Texas, pretty much all of these keys have to be present. About a 60% win with the Democrat in Harris County, pretty much just about a 18% win in Houston, right? A very high turnout in Travis County, about a 35% win in Dallas, winning counties like Tarrant by like 7 or 8 at the minimum, and winning a county like Cullen by 3 or 4, and winning the county like Denton. While simultaneously, Democrats need to ensure lower turnout in the rural areas, and also lower turnout in terms of a lower turnout in the rural areas, lower turnout in some of the more suburban/exurban Republican counties, and also better numbers in some of these Hispanic regions, right? For example, Hillary Clinton got like 70% in counties like Hidalgo, got like 70-something% in counties like Webb, right? Biden did so poorly in those areas, just look at the trends. Anyways, Biden's not going to be able to win the state of Texas because A, the Republican turnout is going to be sky high in the rural areas, and B, Democrats' floor and pretty much ceiling as well in some of these Hispanic areas have plummeted from about a ceiling of like 75%, a floor of like 65%, to about a ceiling of like 60%, and a floor of just like 50%. So that's really bad for Democrats. Anyways, in the state of Texas right now, even if you adjust it, it's about a 6% win for Donald Trump, about an identical win as the 2020 performance. Going to the next state here, the state of Utah. Right, in the state of Utah, some of the polls actually early on had it pretty competitive. Right now, however, unsurprisingly, Trump does have a very substantial lead in the more recent polls. Trump is still expected to win Utah by a safe margin, even after the adjustment. Going to the next state here, the state of Vermont. In the state of Vermont here, Biden only has a 5% lead over Kennedy, which is quite surprising. Anyways, Biden does have a 30% lead in the other two polls. Adjusting that gives Biden a 34% advantage. Vermont easily goes to Joe Biden. Now we see that Joe Biden is at 246 electoral votes, Donald Trump at 250. So the final couple of states here will decide the presidential election. Now we go to the next state here, the state of Virginia. In the state of Virginia here, we do see that Joe Biden and Donald Trump are pretty much still in a single-digit race, but nevertheless, that Biden is up in every single head-to-head matchup. Haley is up against Biden in every single poll that she is included, but again, she is not the Republican. Republicans generally do better with a more moderate/traditional candidate in the Washington, D.C. suburbs, right? Trump has improved significantly in the rural areas. Essentially, in 2008, Obama and McCain tied in the rest of the state if you take away Fairfax County. Democrats now getting huge numbers in Fairfax, won it by 42. Joe Biden won it by 42%. Right? Democrats also won Virginia Beach, Chesapeake, Chesterfield. Those were unimaginable for Democrats back about 2 decades ago. But county like Highland County, right? Trump netted about 600 votes there, very small county. Those are areas actually Mitt Romney only won the county by like 20 points, and John McCain only won the county by like 4 points, which is remarkably significant, a trend towards the Republicans. Anyways, the state of Virginia here, we still anticipate a likely Biden victory after the polls adjust. About a 10% victory for Joe Biden in the state of Virginia, sufficient for a likely margin that boosts Joe Biden to 259 electoral votes to Donald Trump's 250. Washington, here that's 11 electoral votes. That's going to be the 11 electoral votes, the tipping point state that does give the state to Joe Biden. Biden has about a 15% lead overall. And when we adjust it, it's about a 19% lead for Joe Biden. That gives Joe Biden exactly 271 electoral votes, just enough for a win in the presidential level. Biden needs 270, and Trump also needs 270 to win the election. Going to the next state here, which will be the state of West Virginia. The state of West Virginia here, Donald Trump is easily anticipated to win the state over Joe Biden by about, 30-something%. It's easily going to go for Donald Trump. Going to the next state here, which will be the state of Wisconsin. Wisconsin's also a key one, not so key in this map, but if there are faithless electors here, it will be good for Biden to add an additional state. Right now, the lead for Trump is still quite consistent, though Biden actually took the lead for a couple of days. Right now, Trump a 2.6% lead for Donald Trump over Joe Biden. Biden trails at 40% of the vote. Now, Trump has been leading consistently in the recent couple of polls. It's not that surprising that Trump does have this lead. Again, in the state of Wisconsin here, a final analysis. Wisconsin's a state where there's a couple of areas you can divide the state into, about 4 areas. Or maybe 5, depending on how you see it, right? Dane County, that's one of the areas. Milwaukee County, that's one of the areas. We go to the Wow counties, Waukesha, Washington, Ozaukee, that's one of the areas. And the rural areas around Ron Kind's district, right? These type of areas where my mouse is hovering over. Those are areas, these counties, right? For example, Lafayette County, Grant County, these are areas Ron Kind got like 55% of the vote as a Democrat, while now Democrats are just consistently losing. Right, and finally, the rural areas. What Republicans need to win in the state is essentially low Democratic turnout in Dane County, low Democratic turnout in Milwaukee County, huge numbers for Republicans in the rural areas, which Trump maintained. But the reason Trump lost the state was because he was not able to maintain the good numbers from the wild counties. For example, Ron Johnson got like 65% in Waukesha. Trump only got 60%. This is the largest Republican county in the state. Not such a good look for Republicans in the state of Wisconsin if you're not getting at least 60% in Waukesha County. Now, I do believe Wisconsin will go red in this election, but right now, if you adjust the polls by about 4 points in favor of Biden, that still gives Biden a 1.3% win in Wisconsin, sufficient for a tilt margin. We're going to wrap this up with the state of Wyoming here. Not surprising, Trump 53% lead. Even if you adjust it, 50% lead for Donald Trump. Now for the conclusion. It's not surprising here that this is a very close election. Now, this is actually a map that is quite concerning for the Democratic Party, because this is essentially Biden's ceiling, Biden overperforming the polls by 4%. The same margin that Trump overperformed the polls in 2020. What we see is 2 conclusions here. Number 1, Biden can win if he overperforms the polls by a substantial enough margin. Though again, if we see that Arizona and Wisconsin flip, the 2 of the closest states, if Biden overperforms by like 2 instead of 4, he does lose the election. What we see is that Biden's ceiling coming into this election is quite low, at just about 300 electoral votes. Maybe Biden can win Georgia, maybe he can win Nevada, but even with a 4% overperformance, he actually comes short in both of those states. Especially astonishing is the state of Nevada for many people, because this was a state that Clinton carried by a lead margin. Even with Biden overperforming by 4%, Biden's still unable to carry the state of Nevada. Now we see that Biden's probably the best path of Biden winning the election is through Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, the ultimate Rust Belt path, which is pretty much Biden's most likely path to victory in this election. Anyways, this does show that Biden's victory is possible, though not probable, because again, this demands a heavy Biden overperformance in every single competitive state. Anyways, thank you for watching today's video. Be sure to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. You can see a subscribe button in the middle of the video, a video over here where if the polls actually reflect the actual results, and a video over here for a change of tone if Trump overperforms the polls. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day. Goodbye.